It's May 1945. At last, the Nazi shadow is lifting. War has devastated the continent. Now, everyone just wants to get back to living again. But though the guns are now quiet, the Second World War isn't over yet. The Third Reich may have surrendered, but the violence just won't seem to end. For a long time yet, Europe will remain soaked in blood. No sooner have the arms been laid down than another war looms.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
And it won't be long before the rising tide of Nazism has given way to another equally redoubtable tyranny. After all the joy of the 8th of May 1945, Europe is still in the grip of violence. Purges are costing the lives of thousands of victims. The Allies are faced with enormous challenges. More than 40 million people have been displaced during the conflict, and now they all want to go home. Germany is now occupied and divided into 4 zones, and people are still hungry. How can a whole devastated continent be rebuilt? In the cities, the cleanup operation will go on for months. In 1946, though, it all picks up speed. The torturing buildings, the old bunkers, are all destroyed. Sometimes, with a bit of help from the zoo. And winding through the ruins, little railways haul off the tons and tons of rubble. It's a surreal wonderland, a land of childhood regained. And in Warsaw, the trams are running again. It draws an applauding crowd, and many of them are moved to tears. A Polish journalist says of his country, "Wherever you look, you can see the work's begun. A gigantic task has already been accomplished. There are whole stretches cleared of rubble now. The atmosphere is one of noise, dust and work, but also one of hope." The cities are emerging from chaos. Stalingrad, too, is coming back to life. After all, so far, the wounds of war are being patched up. There are schools opening amidst the ruins. In Berlin, the women are the ones going back to school. Since manpower is scarce, they're learning the art of masonry. There's stuff to build, but nothing to build it with. So they recycle. They just clean up all the old bricks and use them again. There are no colanders, so they use German helmets. And the Panzerfausts, the Nazis' anti-tank launchers, make pretty good saucepans. They get more mileage out of those old tires, in the form of brand new soles for their shoes. Even the public gardens of the Reichstag are being transformed into allotments. And the metro's up and running again, lit by improvised skylights. As the months roll by, people are getting used to the post-war world. Berlin's learning to live with its ruins. As one Berlin woman puts it, just knowing we've survived is what gives us the strength to start again from scratch. It'll take more than 20 years to rebuild everything. But even in the news bulletins, you can feel the optimism.
Frühling in Berlin. Die Fassade fiel, aber dahinter blieb Lebensmut, Unerschütterlichkeit und die Fähigkeit, sich anzupassen. Sogar die Blumenkästen werden begossen, wie eh und je. Kinder sind erfinderisch. Die Trümmerstätte wird zur Spielwiese. Im Schöneberger Stadtpark stört kein Bild der Zerstörung das Idyll von Sonne, Lenz und Liegekur. Und im Tiergarten flanieren wieder die Liebespaare, der Hofstaat jedes Frühlings.
All this optimism hides a lot of problems, though. There are still hundreds of thousands of lost orphans. In Berlin, Rome, Naples and Milan, there are at least 200,000 homeless children, and almost 1 million in Poland. In Germany's Soviet zone, news campaigns are launched to try and find their families.
Karl-Heinz Leier aus Berlin. Frau Stroll aus Rastenburg in Ostpreußen.
Das Kind ist namenlos. Gefunden am 24. Januar 1945 auf dem Bahnhof Pankow-Schönhausen. Ein 18 Monate altes Mädchen, gefunden vor über einem Jahr auf einem Feld in Wandlitzsee.
Christiane Körber aus Danzig. Meine Mutter hat sich vergiftet und mein Vater war zuletzt auf Fehler auf einem Kriegsschiff. Wir suchen unsere Muttis und Vatis. Bitte helft sie uns wiederfinden.
The campaign will be broadcast right up until the 1950s and help around 300,000 children find their families again.
Nous avons passé par de durs moments, nous avons encore des embêtements, et dans le pays, bien des gens vous diront, ça ne tourne pas rond.
With the continent inching slowly out of the shadows, people are keen to build a new world, to get the most out of life.
Et simplement, sans façon,
A young French girl writes, everything that represented a post-war first caused a scramble. Bananas, lottery tickets, fireworks. People were rushing off to the fun fair, to the circus, any excuse to get out and get together.
tout remarchera à brève échéance, il y aura du bonheur et le printemps reviendra.
It's a time of reforms. Italy abolishes its monarchy, which will soon be replaced by a republic. France ushers in a new regime, the Fourth Republic. At the same time, in France and Belgium, women at last get the vote. And in both France and Great Britain, the banks, public transport, and energy suppliers are all nationalized. The aim is to transform the economy, to make sure it's working in the interests of everyone, of the nation, and of general prosperity. In France, the social security system is put in place, while in Britain, the National Health Service is founded to provide free health care for all.
This will include X-ray if it's found necessary.
Such was the destruction that architects now want to rethink whole cities. In Britain, to ease the strain on the big cities, a 1946 law decrees that new towns are to be built based on radical new concepts of town planning. France follows suit. Near Marseille, Le Corbusier erects his radiant city. Meanwhile, Le Havre, obliterated by the war, is coming back to life. Things won't be back to normal for a while yet, but the reconstruction has begun. Another hopeful sign for the future is the steep rise in births. The days ahead now look more promising, less bleak. In the East, too, people are dreaming of a new life. But there it's Moscow that'll be calling the tune. The Eastern European states were liberated by the Red Army. So as far as Stalin's concerned, they're under his control. To establish his power there without making waves, his strategy is to get communists into positions of power. In Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Bulgaria, in Hungary, the communist parties are deploying their pawns. Quietly, they're taking all the key positions: justice, the military, home affairs, in an ever more repressive machinery of state. In public, at least, the only one who seems alarmed by all this is former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In March 1946, invited to speak in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill loudly and clearly condemns the rapidly encroaching Soviet menace.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Nobody's listening, though. Eastern Europe's governments are blind to the Red Peril. They're still haunted by the barbarity of the Nazis. In their eyes, Germany is still the real enemy. In Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Poland, these post-war years are the occasion for a vast settling of old scores. And the targets of all this are their German immigrant populations. They may have just arrived or have been there for decades, but from now on, they're persona non grata. In Czechoslovakia, in a liberated Prague, the entire German-speaking population is ordered to wear distinctive swastikas or white armbands. They're forbidden to go to the theater, to eat in restaurants, or even walk in the park, and they're put under curfew too. And the Czech authorities soon go even further. Stripped of their nationality, huge numbers of Germans are now deported. There are so many refugees that whole families are rounded up into transit camps. The Allies make no comment. Indeed, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee declares that any means are valid that will make the Germans understand the total and irrevocable nature of their defeat. But the exodus is not always as peaceful as these images might suggest. The Czech authorities accuse the Germans of all kinds of wickedness. When, at Usti in the Sudetenland, a munitions dump explodes, all fingers immediately point to the Germans. A manhunt is quickly launched. More than 100 people lose their lives. The lynching of Germans is becoming a common event. Not far from Prague, an amateur filmmaker is shooting with his 8mm camera. He sees civilians being forced over to the side of the road. Thousands of Germans are executed like this. One Czech student admits, "We kept our mouths shut, just like the whole of Germany did." More than 2 million Czechs of German origin have been thrown out, to the delight of the news media.
Po 1000 letech poprvé je naše území zbaveno Němců a také naposledy. Naposledy, protože Němci se k nám už nikdy nevrátí.
The Poles too are getting back at their former oppressors. Their German minorities are all run out of the country. Former camps like Majdanek, not so long ago dedicated to wiping out the Jewish race, are now used to coop them up in. Thousands of them will die there. This expulsion of Germans is also the work of the Soviets. They're very greedy in victory, and they help themselves to a slice of Poland. So to redress this, Poland takes part of Germany and expands a good 200 kilometers to the west. The map of Europe is being redrawn. From 1945 to 1947, German-speaking populations are driven out of Eastern Europe. It's one of the biggest floods of refugees in the history of Europe. At least 12 million of them all converge on Germany. By a cruel twist of fate, the banished Germans are all marching along the same route taken by the Jewish victims of the Nazis, who themselves continue to flee the pogroms. As one British colonel says, "We tend to regard occupied Germany as a waste paper basket with a limitless capacity for the unwanted waste of the world." But German minorities aren't the only targets of the violence that still scars the continent. Ethnic cleansing, the settling of old scores, they're everywhere. As if the war had obliterated all the moral codes. In Poland, the nationalist militia are decimating the Ukrainian minorities. Ukrainian militants respond by either massacring or expelling their Polish minorities. In Yugoslavia, Marshal Tito assassinates the Croatian Ustachis, who'd collaborated with Hitler in a reign of terror. His regime wipes out 70,000 of them. In Greece, a civil war sets communists against royalists, a fratricide that results in more than 50,000 deaths. Post-war Europe as a whole would seem incapable of taking a single united step towards a brighter future, and Eastern Europe is still bathing in blood. By 1947, the displaced persons have at last made it home. The German prisoners of war, though, continue to be exploited in the victorious countries. And although in the West some will finally gain acceptance by the locals, in the East they're still being detained in appalling conditions. The Russians, it seems, never forget. Extreme weather and food shortages conspire to finish off any of them who've survived the cruelty of their jailers. One-third of them, about 1 million souls, disappear in the desolate wastes of the gulags. The Jews who've survived are starting a new life in the West. Many of them gather together for the voyage to Palestine, currently under British control. When they leave, it's on clandestine boats. In 1947, an old tub rebaptized the Exodus is transporting more than 4,500 refugees. She's boarded by the Royal Navy, who refused to let the Jews into their promised land. Instead, they're all transferred to prison ships. What's worse, the British then take them back to Germany, where they find themselves back in internment camps. There's a worldwide outcry. Once the scandal has died down, the UN General Assembly votes for partition and for the creation of 2 states, one Jewish, the other Arab. At last, the Holocaust survivors have a destination. Europe, though, washes its hands of them. The problem of the Jewish refugees is a closed case. For the United States, along with their British and French allies, Germany has represented the greatest danger. But with the rampant Stalinization of Eastern Europe, things have changed. In March 1947, 1 year after Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, Harry Truman gives a speech to Congress that will change the face of post-war Europe. Soviet military expansion must be contained by aiding those who are resisting its grasp.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The very existence of the Greek state is today threatened by the terrorist activities of several thousand armed men led by communists. We must take immediate and resolute action.
To prevent the civil war in Greece from driving the country into the hands of the communists, Washington grants military aid to Athens, along with an injection of several $1 million. But Truman has another point. The principal danger, he warns, lies not in a Soviet military threat, since the Russians don't have the bomb. No, the real threat comes from poverty. And in 1947, people are exhausted. The economy is still not back on its feet. In Italy, in France, millions are still poorly housed and bread's still being rationed. So both to prop up Europe and to hold back communism, Washington comes up with a huge project, the Marshall Plan. Its objective is to grant massive credits to Europe to help it out of the slump. Raw materials and machine tools are dispatched to the rescue of the old continent. Stalin is well aware that this Marshall Plan could weaken his hold on Eastern Europe. He forbids all the countries in his clutches to accept Washington's offer. To hinder the Marshall Plan and curb American influence in Europe, Stalin lays his cards on the table. He orders the Western Communist parties to take action. The masses are worn out and don't need much convincing to down tools. And with Stalin's words in their ears, they now step up the pace. In both France and Italy, the communists throw themselves behind the rapidly proliferating strikes. It's starting to look like civil war. The French government fears a coup, and not without reason. All the chaos and disruption is starting to heat up.
Près d'Arras, l'express postal Paris-Tourcoing a déraillé par suite de l'action de criminels anonymes qui avaient déboulonné les rails sur 25 mètres. 24 morts, une quarantaine de blessés. Tel est le bilan de cet attentat abominable.
In his attempt to contain it all, the socialist Minister of the Interior, Jules Moch, gets heavy-handed. He calls up 80,000 reservists and gives them permission to shoot. In a matter of weeks, order is restored at the cost of a few lives. But the communists hadn't managed to foil the Marshall Plan. All those millions from Uncle Sam reboot the old continent's economies. Farmers see their harvests back at pre-war levels, and soon even overtaking them. The Americans are betting on restoring the German economy. A strong Germany will be less costly to maintain and will be a rampart against communism. Prosperity has returned. The Marshall Plan is a godsend, and it saves the continent from disaster. At the same time, though, it leaves it wide open to American big business. Stalin has his own plans for stopping capitalism in its tracks. The name of the game is merger and acquisition, made in Moscow. The ruler of the Kremlin encouraged the communists to get into government, but now he wants them to eradicate the other parties they've been associated to. It's the birth of the single-party state. In Romania, the conservatives are thrown out, the administration is purged. 1,000 magistrates are removed, and the elections are rigged. The communists are now in power. The young King Michael is forced to abdicate. In Hungary, Prime Minister Ferenc Nagy stands up to the communists. In June 1947, his son is kidnapped. He resigns, pays the ransom, and retires to the United States. 3 months later in Bulgaria, the hardcore Stalinist Communist Party leader Georgi Dimitrov comes to power. His rival Nikola Petkov is immediately arrested and condemned to death. He's hanged in September 1947. Meanwhile, in Poland, Stanislaw Mikolajczyk, head of the Polish People's Party, speaks out against the Communist Party. By October, he's in fear for his life, and he and his wife seek refuge in England.
I didn't want to be only a sheep who will be killed, especially because my party couldn't work more.
It's taken Stalin a few months to have his way. Now he has nearly all of Eastern Europe under his flag. Churchill's prophecy has come true. The Iron Curtain has descended across Eastern Europe. One country hasn't given in, though: Czechoslovakia. President Edvard Beneš has always tried to maintain cordial relations with the Soviet Union. Faced with Stalin's opposition to the Marshall Plan, a Czech delegation heads to the Kremlin to try and change his mind. But in vain. On his return, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk says, "I left for Moscow as a minister of a sovereign state. I am returning as Stalin's stooge." Democrat ministers show their opposition to Stalin's stranglehold by resigning in February 1948. The communists aren't slow to react. They stir up the population and arm the workers' militias. 200,000 people take to the streets. A general strike is called. To avoid civil war, President Beneš has no choice but to accept the forming of a majority communist government led by Klement Gottwald, Secretary General of the Czech Communist Party. It's a coup d'etat.
Dnes nejsme více sirotky. Jsme členy velké slovanské rodiny v čele se Sovětským svazem. Toť síla, kterou na tomto světě nikdo nezdolá.
The repression soon follows. In March 1948, Jan Masaryk, one of the very few Democrats to have stayed in power, is found dead beneath the windows of his ministry. Was it suicide in protest at the communist coup? Or was it murder? Democracy itself has been assassinated. The communists are now running everything. President Beneš dies a few months later. Gottwald is elected President of the Republic. Czechoslovakia, too, disappears behind the Iron Curtain. All over the world, these violent seizures of power have got people worried. It's a worry that the French Communist Party and its leader Maurice Thorez do not share at all.
Oui, de tout notre cœur, nous proclamons notre amour ardent pour Staline et nous l'assurons de notre confiance inébranlable. Vive à jamais notre cher et grand Staline, vive le communisme!
The Prague coup, though, is not without consequences. With the Soviets so greedy, one thing's now clear: it's no longer possible to co-manage Germany with the USSR. Having combined together its zones of occupation, the West envisages the creation of an independent West Germany under the protection of Washington. In June 1948, it scraps the old currency and installs the Deutschmark. The Soviets refused to recognize the new currency and immediately hit back. On the 23rd of June 1948, they start cutting off all supply routes to West Berlin. No trains, no cars can get through. Stalin wants the whole city for himself. With no electricity, the factories are all shut down. The city's now blockaded off from the rest of the world. More than 2 million Berliners are in need of supplies, or else they may well starve. There's only one way to get supplies through to West Berlin and avoid them falling into the Soviets' hands. The United States and their allies organize a gigantic airlift. Hundreds of aircraft drop food, equipment and raw materials, wheat, coal, petrol, medicines. Thousands of tons a day get through, right under the noses of the Soviets. For the first time, the West is openly confronting the East. Many observers see this crisis as the prelude to a Third World War. The planes skim so low over the buildings that there are some terrible crashes. The West abandoned Prague. It's not going to let go of Berlin. This act of solidarity is quickly seized on by the US media. The whole of Hollywood heads straight for Berlin. Bob Hope does some clowning. The famous composer Irving Berlin comes to lend his support to the pilots of the free world.
Operation Victuals will soon be on our way, with coal and wheat and hay, and everything's okay. Operation Victuals, as in the sky we go, we won't forget to blow a kiss to Uncle Joe. No one here belittles.
Just 3 years ago, Allied bombers were pounding Berlin. Today, they're feeding it. People line the runways and call out to the pilots, "Don't abandon us. If we lose our freedom, we'll never get it back." The crews drop tiny parachutes loaded with chocolate bars, thus earning the nickname the Candy Bombers. The young Berliners are beside themselves with happiness. The American pilots are supplying the city not just with food, but with hope too.
Auf dem Rhein-Main-Flughafen herrscht ausgesprochener Hochbetrieb, seitdem der Luftverkehr ganz plötzlich mit neuen Kräften unterstützt wurde. Hier bespricht eine Gruppe qualifizierter Jungpiloten die Operationen des Tages.
Mensch, bei dem Wetter willst du starten? Na klar, Mensch, die Berliner warten auf mir.
The blockade drags on for 11 long months. During that time, 278,000 Allied flights provide the city with all it needs to survive. Even little beetles are making happy landings. In the skies, the battle is on, but things are hotting up on land as well. On the 6th of September 1948, the communists attempt to take over all official buildings. 3 days later, a mass protest, 300,000 strong, gathers in front of the Reichstag. City Mayor Ernst Reuter speaks aloud what all Berliners are thinking in their hearts.
Von Berlin heute ruft die ganze Welt. Ihr Völker der Welt, ihr Völker in Amerika, in England, in Frankreich, in Italien, schaut auf diese Stadt und erkennt, dass ihr diese Stadt und dieses Volk nicht preisgeben dürft. Völker der Welt, tut auch ihr eure Pflicht.
Protesters take down the red flag that's flying over the Brandenburg Gate. Violent confrontations break out with the East German police. But the West Berliners stand firm. Their city becomes a bastion of liberty on the right side of the curtain. Germans are no longer thought of as former Nazis, but as the potential victims of Stalinist totalitarianism. The Don't Fraternize order of 1945 is long gone now. Germany has become one of the Allies. The occupiers of yesteryear are today's liberators. The airlift has sealed the friendship between victors and the vanquished. Stalin made a big mistake. Far from getting rid of the Americans, he has driven the Western Zone right into the arms of Uncle Sam. The blockade leads the West to enter into a defensive alliance. This time it's not against Germany, but against the USSR. On the 4th of April 1949, 12 countries become member states of NATO. A part of Western Europe thus places itself under the protection of the US nuclear umbrella.
Uhr. Die Schranken öffnen sich. Die Blockade ist zu Ende. Wagen für Wagen rollt auf der Straße, die 10 Monate lang ohne Leben war.
Stalin lifts the blockade on the 12th of May 1949. Both people and goods now have free passage in and out of the city. In the streets, they're all cheering. We're still alive, they cry. It's a victory for the Western Bloc and a great relief for the people of Berlin. A few days later, a democratic West Germany is born on the territory of the three Western zones, the Federal Republic of Germany. But the ogre in the Kremlin's not done yet. In September 1949, the first Soviet nuclear test takes place. The USSR now has its own atomic bomb. One month later,